Greetings and welcome to Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up. I'm your host, Indrias Kassaye, and I am thrilled to have a dear colleague and friend, Dr. Frieda Outlaw, Executive Academic Program Consultant of the SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association, as our guest today. We are continuing our conversation on the youth mental health crisis with a particular focus on adolescents and young adults from ethnic and racial minority groups in America. For this episode, we will be exploring why rates of suicide among African American youth have been rising at worrying rates for the past 2 decades. Dr. Outlaw, welcome to Mental Health Trailblazers.
Thank you, Indrias, and I'm equally happy to be here, and I'm equally thrilled to be here to share what I do know and what we're all learning about this alarming rising rate of suicide among Black youth. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And let me start by just putting some of the facts and figures out there. In 2019, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a report titled Ring the Alarm, The Crisis of Black Youth Suicide in America, in which they reported in youth ages 10 to 19 years, suicide is the second leading cause of death. And in 2017, over 3,000 youth died by suicide in this age group. Over the past decade, increases in the suicide death rate for Black youth have seen the rate rising from 2.55 per 100,000 in 2007 to 4.2 per 100,000 in 2017. Now, fast forward to 2023, and according to the CDC report released earlier this year, suicide rates among persons aged 10 to 24 years increased significantly during 2018 to 2021 among Black persons, from 8.2 to 11.2, a 36.6% increase. So now, Dr. Outlaw, I need your help to understand what is happening. And if you could, I would like you to paint a historical picture for us to help understand how we have reached the crisis we are facing today, because there was a time in the not too distant past when rates of suicide among African American youth was less than the national average.
Correct.
Yeah. And so let's start with what was going on in your community and other African American communities around the country when it came to suicide, when you were an adolescent and young adult.
Thank you for that. Take me down memory lane. When I was an adolescent, first, let me put the context there. I'm a Southern girl, born in Chicago, but Chicago is kind of the South. It's just up north. But then moved to Kentucky. My father was a coal miner, which would be a shock to a lot of people because they don't know that there were a lot of Black coal miners. That's a whole nother discussion for another day. But I grew up in a company town. U.S. Steel built our town. They built the housing. They built the stores, they built the medical facilities, the whole 9 yards. So it was owned and run by U.S. Steel. So some of the common problems of people of African descent during the 50s and the 60s when I was an adolescent, I did not experience, like there was no poverty in Lynch, Kentucky. So when I was growing up, though, although we were in that planned town, it still was demonstrative of the times, meaning that it was segregated. Black people lived here, white people lived there. We went to different schools. I started out at the Lynch Colored School. And when I say that, sometimes people, and if you're in diverse company, they would get a little nervous, you can tell. But we loved our Lynch Colored School because the teachers lived in our community. They were young Black women and some men who lived in our community. The minister lived in our community. Everybody lived in our community. We knew what to expect when we went to school. They knew how to talk with our parents about our behavior. But they taught us an appreciation of loving ourselves, what our gifts were, and they brought out for a lot of people gifts that you would not have ordinarily, I don't think, would have been recognized.
And how prevalent was suicide in your community?
Well, we didn't know anything about that. And certainly among my peers, we were indoctrinated with believing that you had to live a life, and if you were sinful, that you prayed and you asked forgiveness for your sins, and you could be forgiven if you were a person committed to living a Christian life. that God would forgive you. You had to ask for forgiveness after you did it. So we all were indoctrinated with the idea we couldn't commit suicide because there was no way you could get to heaven if you died by suicide.
And do you think that might be a major reason why rates of suicide among African American youth historically was lower than among other groups?
I think it's much more complicated than that. I think that there's no one reason that we can point to. But I think, Indrias, it was a combination of having good support systems, good foundations, being taught this whole idea of resilience. They didn't call it resilience. They would just say, pick yourself up. You can work through this. Talk to God about it. Talk to your teacher about it. You can find a solution. And then oftentimes, what would be invoked also was stand on the shoulders of your ancestors. Look what your ancestors had to go through, and so forth and so on. So we were inundated with a lot of what I would call protective factors.
We began this conversation with me asking you to paint a historical picture, mapping out the developments and the contributing factors that from the turn of the 21st century onwards have resulted in suicide rates among African American youth to start climbing. What were some of the ingredients, if you will, for what must be a toxic cocktail that has eroded the mental health resilience, and you used that word resilience earlier, that your generation had? How did we get to where we are today?
Well, I think, again, it's very complex. And I believe that segregation or desegregation, and I know this may be controversial, but I stand by it. I really believe this. I think it had good results for some things, but there was some really unintended negative consequences that maybe started us on the route. And I'm not blaming it. I'm thinking we didn't recognize what kinds of supports we needed to build in to keep our young people prepared for the world that they're going to live in. Because this is a world where there is invidious discrimination, there's systemic racism, there's all of these things. And I can understand it from a mental health profession and from a parent of 3 boys that we had to raise in a situation where we had this foundation. I think as things got more dispersed, we didn't live in communities where they were segregated or where you knew everybody and everybody had your best interests. So I think as we were making tailwind in the world in terms of positions in universities that we had not been before, or jobs in corporate, or whatever it was, some of our foundation wasn't there. And then church membership, as you know, is going down in communities of color, or people are taking other avenues to find their spirituality. I think as we make progress in some ways, we are getting diluted in other ways in what we have called the traditional protective factors. I think that's one of the big things that we need to look at. But however, Indrias, I would like to impress on people, I think we also have to go into communities where we're having these rising rates of suicide, and we have to work with the people in the communities, and we have to include those youth. I think we have to look at different groups of color, and we have to look at what they think are protective factors and what they think would help them to build the kind of resilience or the kind of protection that would prevent them from attempting or dying by suicide. Now, the one thing we do know from the research, and I've been very excited about this actually, is the work of ACEs. So that's how they started to put trauma with health. The ACEs research has connected suicidal ideation attempts and successful dying by suicide with ACEs, and it makes sense the number of ACEs that people have, and they think it's connected so prevalently in communities of color. And these are communities of color of African descent and other minority communities of color. It's because of the high number of ACEs. Because the ACEs is the more you have, the more vulnerable you are to health and mental health conditions.
So these ACEs are
adverse childhood experiences.
right. Mm-hmm.
Now, going back to my childhood, there were actually lots of kids. So one of the ACEs is family abuse and family dysfunction and those kind of things, right? So we had family dysfunction. When I was growing up, we had a lot of family dysfunction because we had a lot of alcoholism, not so much drugs. It was alcohol, that generation, my father's generation. So there was a lot of stuff going on, which if they had been counting ACEs back then, there would have been children that had a number of ACEs. I think the protective factor, we had for the most part teachers. Mm-hmm. They knew the families. They knew what was going on. So that was that protection. And the kids, we supported each other. We protected each other. I don't think we have that same kind of tradition and standard now.
Yeah.
And I think as we've pushed our children, me being one of them too, of that generation, pushed our children to, to achieve and to do better and to stand up and not show weakness or do what we need to do. I think that's the whole piece around mental health issues in Black communities, why we have so much stigma in Black communities, because we already believe that we are being judged as less than, right? Mm-hmm. By standards that have been manufactured by people that have nothing to do with us.
Right.
It's a racist look. It's a systemic racist look to control people's power and whatever. It's a power dynamic. So we already know that. So we don't want to show any weaknesses. So you want to speak a certain way. You want to act a certain way. You want to do all of these things that might be counter indicated to what your person is. And so we're
code switch.
Yes, it's well, code switching to me is a little bit different because that's when people know they're putting on. And some people can do it because they have a temperament to do it. Some people cannot do it. I don't know if people pick this up in the story about the Temptations, if you've ever seen this play or watched the movie. That's what Paul Williams could not do. That's why he died by suicide. He could not code switch.
Yeah.
He could not do it.
Right.
And it made him more and more depressed. It made a person who didn't drink at all, started drinking to cope, got depressed, and ultimately couldn't figure a way out of it except to die by suicide.
Right.
That's always my example of that. He couldn't do it.
You mentioned alcohol being the major substance that was abused when you were growing up. Move fast forward to the 80s, you've got things like crack, and you've got those things that are ravaging the community. And then I also want you to reflect on the amplification of what people have called Black trauma that happens through the media and then through social media, because it's very interesting how the numbers for increasing rates of suicide begin to take off as the internet is taking off.
Yes. So I know we're getting long here, but I think it's important to thread this needle.
Yeah.
I want to say that when I was growing up, though, that we didn't have ACEs or people that hadn't put it together, and we did have some protective factors. But those protective factors lasted as long as that kid was growing up in that town. But we had a lot of people who left and really didn't have the quality of life that they would have wished for, because I think that the protective factors were gone and all what had happened to them growing up, and then they got more of it when they moved to the city and they didn't get the job they wanted or something else happened. We had a lot of young people that got into drugs, and probably a lot of them who were part of that crack epidemic and that kind of thing. So I think that that's part of it. And I think that one of the things that happened, I know people are going to faint when they hear this. When I first was a little girl, we didn't have television.
Right.
My view of the world was through books. And that's why I think I read so much. I love reading books because they took you out of your environment. I believe television was the first exposure to what the other world was like, and it's gotten more and more sophisticated with social media. But I think for young girls, and of course, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to say that right away, but I've been trying to follow the research. I think for young women of African descent, the first notion had to do with appearance. That's always been a notion in communities of color. But back in my day, boys liked us the way we looked. And so I never worried about my hair or my whatever. But nowadays, there's a different way that people are measuring themselves. And sometimes when you are measuring yourself against standards that are not real, or that you actually don't want to measure yourself about, but you feel a pressure, I think it's that.
Yeah.
I also think that even when I was raising my boys, there was bullying, and there was bullying when I was a kid. We called it picking on you. That's what we used to call it. Somebody's picking on you. And they did it over and over and over again until it stopped, or they got tired of it, or you stood up, or whatever happened. I think that what is different even in the generation of my boys, one's in their 50s, one's in their 40s, and one just turned 40 from being 39. It stopped when they got home because there wasn't this constant input that kids get now with their cell phones and all the different platforms that they're on.
Home was a safe space.
Yes, home used to be a safe space, and now it's not so much. It's because it's coming in. Yeah,
24/7.
And 24/7, and it's just too much.
I think another thing is also the amplification of just the negative stories, the hurt that happens in African American communities. George Floyd, and as an immigrant person, I always think of those border patrol people on horses chasing down the Haitian migrants. All of these things that it's like an unrelenting display of violence.
Of violence, and violence against you that you can. I, as a mother of grown men of color, Black men of color, I still worry because there's a vulnerability that you cannot control. So that kind of stress, I think, is one of the stresses that David Williams is talking about. And Chester Pierce, who was a brilliant Black psychiatrist at Harvard, did not get his due. He actually coined the word macroaggressions. Chester Pierce is dead now. But Chester Pierce used to say, people of color of African descent, and I'm sure he would include other people of color now, live with what he called extreme mundane stress. He said it's like having rocks in a bag, and you're going up a hill. And after a while, it's just what it is, but it's wearing on you, even if you're not conscious of it.
And when you have those, and then you have this erosion of hope that comes when you are confronted with a system that that is not fair and doesn't give you an equal chance, then it can easily lead to thoughts of what's the point?
This is where community is so important.
Yeah.
Because what community can do is build you up again.
Yeah.
And this is why community engaged research, and again, a little plug for the Minority Fellowship Program. this is where I believe we have, over this almost 50 years, plugged up some holes and will continue to plug up holes because we have people who are looking at these issues through the lens that we're talking about today. Because I think left to itself, this is not a way people would have looked at certain kinds of things that are happening and why it's important to have community and why it's important to include community in your research and the people who are actually living the experiences. Because one of the fallacies of research prior to diversifying the research workforce, including psych nurses, was that people just sat around and imagined what they thought might be a good fix for what was happening in a community of color, but it was from a European perspective. And what they found is that the interventions that were being developed in somebody's mind were not effective because people were not going to embrace them.
I'm glad that you brought up interventions. Are there character or personality traits that you think might indicate greater vulnerability to suicidal ideation? Are there warning signs for parents, for family members, other care providers, including healthcare professionals, that an adolescent or young person might be considering suicide?
So I think, rather than say what characteristics, I think we need universal testing. Mm-hmm. Universal testing proved its worth to me during the HIV epidemic. You don't want to look at who you think might have HIV. If we had universal screenings, we're now pushing for universal screenings for ACEs. So one of the connections would be, in my mind, and where I think the research ought to go, is if you have universal screenings for ACEs, for instance, if you see somebody that has 3 or more, or in sometimes 2 that you think are horrific, then you would want to screen that person for depression first. I think universal screening for ACEs, depression, and suicide would be a good thing. Now, I'm going to tell you, we did that. That was an innovation. We did that when we had a nurse-managed center at the University of Pennsylvania. We had a grant, and we were out in Southwest Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And the social determinants of health, when you have people who have certain social determinants of health, you might want to screen too. For instance, we know that there are prevalence of suicide ideations, attempts, and completions with people who are very poor, mm-hmm. people who've had abuse, people who have unstable housing, those kind of things. So we know that there are some associations. So if you know that, if you did a screening for ACEs and you did a screening for depression, and one of the questions in the depression screening is a question on suicide. And we really found it to be very helpful. So these are the kinds of things I think we need to be looking at.
And then once you've identified that a person might be depressed or might be on some sort of pathway to potential suicide, what do you think psychiatric mental health nurses in particular, but other behavioral health professionals should be doing to better respond to them, to provide them effective care?
Now, we know that if a person is very actively suicidal, you got to treat that as an emergency. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, it used to be when I was practicing, that meant a hospitalization until you could get a person stabilized. And then you went into some treatment for depression and maybe some family therapy. It depended on then the needs of that person. And it's not going to be one size fits all. This is where you have to then make a treatment plan for the individual or the family that you're working with.
How has healthcare been responding to African American youth? I've heard that, for example, mental health diagnoses for African Americans is a lot of times different from Caucasian Americans.
Yes, you're right. So we do know that oftentimes Black kids that are depressed youth are diagnosed as conduct disorders and things like that, which lead to criminal behavior rather than a depression, which leads to a different kind of treatment. Now, we know that there was evidence across the board, at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, that proper medication, proper diagnosis, medication, and cognitive behavior therapy was effective, and the research was pointing in the direction, trending in the direction that it would be effective across racial ethnic groups. But you're right, it's the proper diagnosis that first is important to do, because a lot of times young Black men are diagnosed as angry, and they are diagnosed more as criminals more than being depressed. And I used to say, these little boys that I oftentimes will work, I was oftentimes working with younger children, some adolescents, but younger children. I said, these are agitated depressions. You can just look in their little sad eyes. These are agitated depressions, but you have to have a compassion for them when you look in their eyes to know that they're sad, right, instead of knowing that they're hateful.
Right.
And that's where I think having a person who is matched by race or ethnicity, or who has been trained, I think people can get in touch with their own biases and get trained to learn a different way to be a therapist. I do believe that. I spent a lot of my career trying to train some of them, because it's never going to be enough to match or match.
Right. Are there any tips that you have or suggestions about how mental health nurses, psychiatric mental health nurses, can improve on how they've been doing this kind of work? Like, what do they need in their toolbox to respond better to this, what essentially is an epidemic of young African Americans deciding to end their lives by suicide?
I believe that psychiatric nurses that are being educated now, and the ones of us old timers too, our legacy people, we are committed to making life better for young people of African descent and other BIPOC people. I believe that. And so I think we are working in our own capacities to create ways to have thought experts and those kind of people to create new knowledge, to work in places where we can have policy, to impact policy, because that's very important, and to also be in clinical positions and learn. And also, I think we've been able to embrace this very well, of including our communities in our people, our faith-based establishments, because a lot of our churches are willing to help and change. They just need to be taught. Plus, I think we need to make our voices and presence known other than places where we are usual suspects. I mean, like clinics and FQH, federally qualified health centers, clinical mental health centers, academic centers, the places where we are. We need to broaden, and we need to get on boards. It can be local, it's state, national, but I believe you really can make a big imprint in your local boards and your committees, and you have to be willing to do some things sometimes that you don't get paid for, in terms of having your presence be known. And also making your presence, a lot of psych nurses of African descent I know are in sororities and fraternities. You've got to work on that group of people, because they're a lot of times, a lot of those people in influential places. Mm-hmm. I just did a piece with 100 Black men, in which I was encouraging them to normalize mental health and substance use, and to normalize it and destigmatize it, and then gave them steps to how they could work in their communities to do that. We have to use our expertise as psych mental health nurses in our communities to enlighten our people to mental health is just part of health.
Right.
And there is no health without mental health.
Yeah.
And so we all know that we have been impacted in our families and our communities with people who have mental health or substance use issues. And it's going to take that old cliche we say, it's going to take a village. And that village includes providers as well as communities.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Outlaw. I want us to end on a positive note. What do you think must happen today and in the medium and then long term to ensure that 2 decades from now, when we look back or when we report on what's happening in terms of suicide amongst African American youth, we can say that we have curbed these alarming rises and that we are back to where things were and that things have been reversed and that we can celebrate instead of lament?
So I'm going to start with the positive.
Okay.
I think that this awareness is the positive, but the awareness that has gotten wind under its wings now. There was a time when Black people used to say, Black people don't commit suicide. They used to actually say that to me when I was a therapist. I said, yes, they do. And so we are embracing it. We're making people aware. We're making communities aware. And I think we're going to keep it as a focus. Destigmatize it. Keep it as a focus. Have people who have the lived experience of have lost children be part of the group that inform us. And, there was a time when people would shame and blame. We know better than that now. And I think building these collaborations will be the silver lining and the hope for protecting our children as they go forward. And realizing that their protective factors may be different from ours. They won't have the same building blocks that we had. But whatever they are, we've got to maximize them.
Right.
And make them fit what they believe.
Right.
Yes.
And on that note, Dr. Outlaw, thank you very much. I think there is indeed reason for hope. And yeah, we'll continue fighting the good fight.
Yes, and we have to remember Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive. You have to always keep hope alive. I do believe that.
Amen for that. Okay.
Yeah, amen for that.
All right. Thank you very much. And that does it for this episode of Mental Health Trailblazers, Psychiatric Nurses Speak Up. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion, and I look forward to you joining us on future episodes. This is the Minority Fellowship Program at the American Nurses Association podcast, featuring nurse scientists addressing the psychiatric and mental health issues affecting underrepresented communities across America. You can always find us online at emfp.org and wherever you get your favorite podcasts. The views expressed by the speakers and host do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government.